Hello, this is Rezarat from Radacad, and in this video I'm going to talk about Gateway. What is Power BI Gateway, how to install it, what are setup considerations, how the access level is set up, what type of gateway you should install. So anything you need to know about Power BI Gateway, we are going to talk about it in this video. Let's start with what is the gateway. Power BI Gateway, which is the one that we are talking about in this video, is a application that you download. It's a free application. You don't have to pay for it or anything like that. It's an application you download and install on one of the local machines in a local domain in on-premises local space, not in a cloud space. And then this will create the connection from Power BI objects in the cloud, such as Power BI Dataset, Power BI Data Mart, Power BI Data Flow, any of those objects to the on-premises data sources. An example of that is when you have a database in SQL Server in a local domain server, and the Power BI database, Power BI dataset is in the cloud and wants to get this data refreshed overnight. This requires an application to create that connection. That application is called Gateway. Now, depending on the type of that gateway that you use, you may be able to use it in other applications, not just Power BI, or you might just be able to use it inside the Power BI. And this type of application is useful for all types of data sources, from SQL Server database, Oracle database, an Excel file that is in a shared folder in a local domain. So no matter what data source it is on premises, Gateway can create that connection. If you don't have any on-premises data sources, like your data sources are things that are in cloud, such as Google Analytics, Azure SQL Database, you don't need a gateway for them. So gateway is only required if you have on-premises local data sources. One of the first things that you also need to know, in addition to what the gateway is that now what type of gateway you should install. There are two gateway types. Again, the difference is not in the licensing or anything like that. The difference is in the persona of the user who is using it. If I'm the only developer in my organization, it's a small team of people. Let's say I'm the only developer. I would have Power BI users. They are connecting to my reports and consuming the reports, but they are not really developers themselves. Then I would go ahead with installing personal mode of the gateway because it is simple to set up. It has some limitations, such as, for example, it only supports import data connection. It does not support direct query or live connection. And it wouldn't allow team engagement. Like, for example, I cannot share this gateway with another developer in my team. It's not designed for that kind of purpose. If I want to do that kind of things, if I'm in a team of developers, then I better to go with on-premises data gateway, standard gateway, enterprise gateway. There has been a lot of names throughout many years for this. The current name as of now that we are recording this video is called the standard gateway, but it is always marked as recommended gateway. This is a gateway that you can install. It has a little bit more setup process to do, but it supports all types of connections: import, direct query, live connection. It's a gateway not just for Power BI. You can use it for Logic apps, for Power Apps, for Microsoft Flow, which is Power Automate, Azure Analysis Services. It gives you a team control over the gateway. You can share it with others, and that is the gateway we will be discussing more about in this video. Another important thing before talking about installation of the gateway is that how the gateway refresh process happens. It is important to know it because when you ask the gateway to be installed, you ask it from the IT team or the network team, they would come and say, how can I trust this application? It's a third-party application. You want to install it on my local servers, and it might create a security breach because other applications can access to our local domain through it. So if you know how this works, this can be a good explanation to pass on to those guys so that they know that it is not creating a security breach. Imagine we have a Power BI dataset in the cloud. That Power BI dataset is supposed to get refreshed from a database in on-premises server. So some credentials related to that server is stored in Power BI space in cloud. The Power BI dataset is scheduled to refresh, so there are some services that passing these requests to refresh through scheduler service to data movement service that passes to the service bus. Service bus is like a kind of not gateway, but it's a bus that creates a connection between that passes everything between cloud and on-premises space in Microsoft Azure. Requests will stay in a service bus like a queue, and gateway time by time go and check that queue and see if there's a request available there. Does it need to be responded? If yes, it will go and query the database, get the result back, pass it to the service bus, and that then pass it all the way to that Power BI dataset. Data gets refreshed. The most important part in this architecture is understanding that it is the gateway that goes and check the service bus time by time. It is not service bus that triggers the gateway, because if it was like that, if service bus could trigger the gateway, you had an external application, something from World Wide Web could trigger something in a local domain, and that was a security breach that would have needed an inbound security port to be open. But for gateway, you don't need an inbound port. It just requires outbound. So that makes this connection secure. Now, if I have online data, do I need a gateway? No. This gateway is only for on-premises data sources. So if you have Google Analytics, CRM Online, Azure SQL database, you don't need a gateway for that. However, if you have SQL Server installed in an Azure virtual machine, then yes, you need to install a gateway on that virtual machine. There is a set of requirements for gateway to set up, which is mentioned in this. Usually it's a .NET framework. The most up-to-date version of that is better. You need 8-core CPU, 8 GB memory. That is the recommended setup. And it is not recommended to install it on a domain controller itself. And usually the network team and the IT team wouldn't allow you to do that anyway, because that's the most sensitive server in the whole local domain usually. Ports that need to be open are these ports, and you can also find them in my blog article. The link to that is down in the description below. Go and check it out. And these are all outbound ports. As I said, there is no requirement for inbound ports. This is fully secure setup. Now, how the installation works. So you go and download the Power BI Gateway. You can just search for Power BI Gateway, download it, the version that you want, then go ahead and install it. One gateway is usually enough. You don't need more than one gateway. However, in some scenarios, you might need to set up a cluster, or you might need more than one gateway, depending on the way that you use it. When you set up the gateway, it asks for your Power BI accounts. That is one of the things. And another thing is this part. This part is the most important part in installing the gateway. You need a name for the gateway. The name is important because based on that name, then you might be able to find where that gateway is installed, because you have, let's say, too many servers in local domain. Which gateway has, which server this has installed. So that name is good to have some indication of where it is installed. If you want to add it in a cluster, that is the place you can go ahead and do it. A cluster of gateway is a group of gateway installed on separate machines, but they are like bundled to each other so that they look like one gateway. This is for situations that, for example, one of them is failed, the other one would still operate. If this one fails, that one would operate. So you would always have high availability in your gateway. The recovery key is another key important piece here. This recovery key is like a password, but this password is only needed when you want to restore this gateway somewhere. Let's say I have installed the gateway on this machine and this was working for the past 5 years. Now, somehow the IT team decided that this machine is not useful anymore. It is too old. We want to migrate it to a new machine. So we want to really build a new machine and set up gateway on that. Now, in this gateway, I might have hundreds of data sources defined, connected to hundreds of data sets. If I go and install it on the new machine, I have to add all of these data sources and their setups and creating the connection. It would be quite a big job itself. However, if I have this recovery key, what I can do is that I can go to the new machine and then just restore this gateway on there. And that would bring all the data sources, their connections, everything. I just need the name and the key to get it recovered. It would be just a 5 minutes job. So it is important to store this information somewhere important. The successful installation of a gateway would show you something like this. So that application is installed on your machine. Now the next step is that you go into the Power BI service. In Power BI service, there's a place that you can go and say manage gateways. You'll be able to see all the list of all gateways. I'm going to show you in a second as well. This can also show you personal gateways. Previously, you could not see personal gateways, but recently Power BI team has made some changes. You can see on-premises and personal gateways. After seeing the gateways, you can also go and create data source connections. So the gateway is just an application that creates the connection from cloud to on-premises. But then for each data source you are connecting to, you need to create a data source. For example, if you are connecting to this SQL Server database, you need to create a data source for that. If you are connecting to this Excel file and want to import data from it, that Excel file is in a shared folder in local domain, you need to create a data source for that. To find out what data sources you have in your Power BI file, it's always a good idea to go to Power BI desktop. Under data source settings, you'll be able to find what exact data sources you are using. Make sure that you have all of them defined under that gateway. Otherwise, your dataset might not get refreshed. So after you go and define those, and the process of definition of the gateway is not really complicated, you just go and choose the type of data source, authentications. When you created that data source, then you can go to the dataset published in the Power BI service and create that mapping. That dataset, you would say, for example, in this dataset, I have this Excel file needed. This Excel file is coming from this data source under this gateway. You create that mapping. Sometimes you can even create that data source from this stage if you have enough privilege and access to the gateway to do so. So that is the process of setting up the gateway. Now let me talk about some gateway user access control. But before that, I would like to show you what the gateway setup in Power BI service is. So when I come to Power BI service, when I go to manage connections and gateways, I'll get to this place. This place show me all the gateways that I have. These are on-premises standard gateway that I installed. But if I want to see also personal gateways, I can go and select it in here, as you can see. Now for each gateway, I can select it. The gateway can have a set of users. So that is where the important part comes, that for the gateway, you can set different users. Now what these users are doing. So when you go to a gateway and go to manage users, there are, let's say, 3 types of access level for a user. A user can be only connection creator in the gateway. A connection creator is someone who creates a data source, basically. Let's say I want to use this gateway to create a connection to that on-premises SQL Server database. And I have to set up the credential requirement for that. So I use it, then I create connection to my dataset and it works. But I would not be able to go and remove the gateway or change some clustering setup in the gateway. I am only a data source connection creator. Connection creator with resharing, I can do everything that a connection creator can do. I can also do some resharing. An admin is full access on the gateway. I can do everything a connection creator can do. Plus, I can set up the gateway. I can go and change the setting of that, the cluster setting, add or remove items to the cluster. I can go and remove the gateway if I want to. And there is also one level of access, which is tenant administrator. If you are a tenant administrator for Power BI, you can go and turn on this option. Then this would show you all gateways that are defined under your tenant, even those gateways that you have not created it. And it is also quite interesting that if you are a tenant administrator, you can choose who are gateway installers. By default, everyone in the organization can install the gateway, which can be sometimes trouble making, because you may have, let's say, hundreds of users. They don't know what they are doing if they are installing a personal gateway where there is actually an on-premises standard gateway installed for them. So in this case, you can go and turn it on and only give access to those whom you want to be able to install the gateway. So these are gateway users, but in addition to those, we also have data source users. So as I mentioned, under the gateway, we have multiple data sources. Each data source can have a set of users. The difference between defining users at the data source level and defining it at the gateway level is that if you define a user at the gateway level, that user have access to everything under that gateway. But if you define it under the data source level, only that data source is authorized for that user, which is usually a better option if this type of user, for example, is only accessing that SQL Server database or these 2-3 data sources only. Then you go and give them access to that data source. On that data source, you basically just go and to manage users, and kind of similar situation with the 3 levels of access, but the difference here is that if you are the user of a data source, you can use that data source, you cannot delete it, you cannot change the configuration of that, you can just use it in a Power BI dataset, data flow, a connection, bind that connection to this. You are basically just the user. You can be a user and share that access also with someone else, and the owner of the data source can actually remove the data source, can change the setting of the data source, can add other users to that data source. It is important to understand the difference between gateway users and the data source users. You don't want to give too much access when the user just need to have access to 2 data sources. If you are giving too much access, you need to make sure that the user is trained enough to deal with that level of access and it does not cause a trouble. The next thing is gateway settings. So quite a bit of content to cover in this gateway setup. So the next thing is gateway settings. So gateway has some settings which you already saw, but there are also some additional settings. If I go to the setting of gateway, these 3 are quite interesting settings to consider. These 3 settings, the first one is when you have a gateway cluster, which is a group of gateways which automatically fail over cluster. Now you can use that setup for load balancing. What is load balancing? Let's say you have too many requests coming at the same time. Now you want to balance this across multiple gateways. You can do that if you have a set of gateways installed as a cluster of gateway. And these links would help you to learn more. The links are down in the description to my blog article. You'll find them under there as well. Another thing, which is this option, quite important, if you have in Power Query, you can merge data sources together, you can append them, combine them. Now, if this combining happening in one single query, you have data sources on-premises and data sources cloud-based, they are all in one single query and you are doing this combining, then you need this option to be checked. If they are different separate queries and then you combine it, then that's fine. But for combining them in a single query, you'll need that. And the last one is when you create a custom connector in Power Query, Power BI, you can create a connector yourself. I have written a blog article about that. When you create that connector, then you can use that connector through that gateway. There are a couple of places to set it up. Once is in the gateway installation itself, in the connectors tab, you go and choose the folder that the connectors are, and in here you go and enable this. The last thing about gateway is that you can use some troubleshooting on the gateway, and the way that you do that troubleshooting is that under the gateway application itself, it comes with some logs and things like that, but you can enable more logging in that gateway, and there's a logging tab which is coming here. There's a diagnostics tab which you can enable additional logging, but enabling additional logging will bring some overhead into your gateway day-to-day type of work. So make sure that you just enable it for a short period of time, find out what are the errors, and then disable it. There are also folders with zip files which has the default logs of the gateway as well. The gateway service is like a network service. This network service is running in your Windows services. Usually you'll have on-premises data gateway, which you can start and stop it from here. Best is that this should be always running. You don't install it on a laptop, you install it on a server. It is always up and running, but there are options to reset it if you want to, or change some configurations related to that. So this was an overall summary of the Power BI Gateway, what it is, how you can install it, how you can use it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have weekly videos on Power BI. Until the next video, have fun.